Dear colleagues, I have been involved with IOP for over 30 years, but I don't recall a symposium ever concerning topics like this one. However, its appearance could have been expected. After all, both psychophysiologists and Buddhist scholars are essentially engaged in solving the psychophysiological problem, namely the relationship between the mind and body, which in Western science uh, was formulated by Descartes and in Buddhism has existed since time immemorial. The study of the phenomena and practices developed in Buddhism for 2.5 millennia with the help of modern scientific methods is of great interest. The implementation of the works that will be reported on became possible primarily due to the course taken by the Dalai Lama XIV, aimed at the widespread involvement of Western science in the study of psychophysiological phenomena observed in Buddhist practices. His motto is, if I see a discrepancy between the dogma of Buddhism and scientific discovery, I believe that it is necessary to change the dogma. It allows to investigate at the modern scientific level the psychophysiological mechanisms of altered states of consciousness, meditation, the interaction of mind and body in the Buddhist practices, and some moments associated with death. At the same time, we do not touch upon the philosophical and religious aspects of Buddhism in any way, only physiology. Thanks to the Dalai Lama, we have been able to conduct a wide range of research in Buddhist monasteries in India with the involvement of experienced monk practices and with the help of young monk researchers. We have received special training, who have received special training at our institutes. Some of the results will be presented to you today. These are the results obtained by 3 groups of scientists, geographically dispersed, but working in a coordinated manner according to a mutually agreed plan. First, we present to you the report of Dr. Davidson, a prominent scientist who has been studied the psychophysiology of phenomena for many years. Then I will report some of the results obtained by us in laboratories that opened in monasteries. After that, I offer you a report aimed at acquainting you with the views of our colleagues, Buddhist scholars, about Buddhist contents of the investigated meditative practices and phenomena. I do not share his view, but I would like to acquaint you with the Buddhist view of the phenomenon. Finally, we will conclude with the presentation of our young colleague about the psychophysiological correlates of one very special type of meditation. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Richard Davidson, and I'm delighted to be with you today at this symposium for the International Organization of Psychophysiology. I'm really honored to be part of this symposium, and I will give a short presentation to talk a little bit about the emergence of what we call contemplative neuroscience. Contemplative neuroscience is a hybrid discipline that represents bringing the best of rigorous neuroscience to bear on the understanding of the practices that have emerged in the contemplative traditions that have been used for thousands of years to train the mind to increase well-being and promote optimal human flourishing. We will consider a number of important historical issues in the foundations of contemplative neuroscience. And then I'll share with you a framework for understanding the plasticity of well-being that represents the intersection of the contemplative traditions and modern neuroscience. So first, just a little bit of background. This is a photograph that was taken in 2001 of the Dalai Lama visiting our laboratory at the University of Wisconsin-Madison in the USA, where we were showing him, this was back in 2001, how we can use MRI to interrogate the structure and function of the human brain. The Dalai Lama had heard about these technologies before, but he'd never seen a live demonstration. And it was a very important one for him because he saw how pure mental activity that was not associated with any overt behavior can lead to systematic and lawful changes in brain function that we can visually observe. I want to now discuss several major themes in modern science which provide the foundation for the work that we and other colleagues in contemplative neuroscience are doing. The first is neuroplasticity. All of you have heard this word before, and we simply use it to remind us that the brain is constantly changing. It's constantly being shaped, and it's being shaped wittingly or unwittingly, intentionally or unintentionally. Most of the time, our brains are being shaped unwittingly or unintentionally. Most of the time, we are not fully cognizant of the forces around us which are shaping our brain. And moreover, we typically have little control over those forces. And the invitation in this work is that we can actually take more responsibility for our own brains. And the key finding in many scientific studies over the last 15 years is that when we cultivate positive qualities of our mind, it turns out that our brains also change. And we believe that these changes in the brain enable these characteristics of well-being to endure. The second theme is the equivalent, if you will, of neuroplasticity in the realm of genomics, and this is epigenetics. And epigenetics is the science of how our genes are regulated. And we all have a fixed complement of base pairs, which is our DNA. And for the most part, that's not going to change over the course of a person's lifetime. But what will change is the extent to which any given gene is turned on or turned off. And findings indicate that when we train our mind, we actually see changes in epigenetics, changes in the expression of genes which regulate plasticity, regulate inflammation, and other characteristics that are important for our health and well-being. The third theme is increased understanding of the bidirectional communication between the mind and brain and the body. Our minds and brains are embodied. And it turns out that when we train our mind, not only does it affect our brain, but it affects our bodies in ways that are consequential for our health. And when we alter our bodies, for example, if we change our microbiome, it will in turn modulate our brain function, which will influence our mind. And so these pathways are bidirectional, and they help us to understand how our well-being is related to our physical health. And finally, the last theme is a theme that we call innate basic goodness. And what this is referring to is scientific research which more and more compellingly illustrates that when human beings first come into the world, they come in with a propensity to prefer pro-social interactions. And why this is important is because some of the strategies in the contemplative traditions are strategies to cultivate compassion and kindness. And it turns out that this is really nurturing qualities that are there from the start. And so we're not beginning with a blank slate, but rather we're beginning with a predisposition that is part of our nature. So let's now dive in. But before we dive in, I simply want to remind us of how urgent this need is. The trajectory that humanity has been on, even pre-pandemic, was not a particularly healthy or sustainable one, with rates of depression and anxiety and suicide skyrocketing in many different parts of the world. We need to have strategies to help us cultivate the skills that will promote resilience. And we need to do this globally. We need to do this at each different age group. And we need to do this in ways that are accessible and scalable. So I want to now feature a framework that we have developed in our center on the 4 pillars of a healthy mind. These are key components that reflect the plasticity of well-being. And in an article that we published quite recently, we've articulated the scientific underpinnings of these 4 pillars. So let me go through each briefly, and then we'll take a deeper dive into each of them. The first pillar is awareness, which is where we would place attention. This is extremely important in helping us to focus and concentrate. And also, this is related to a quality that we call meta-awareness, which is knowing what our minds are doing. And it turns out that we can strengthen these through training. The second pillar we call connection. Connection refers to the qualities that are important for healthy social relationships, qualities like appreciation and kindness and gratitude. And again, scientific research shows that these can be cultivated, and they are associated with different brain networks than awareness, but brain networks that will exhibit plasticity and can be shaped through training. The third pillar we call insight. Insight is referring to a curiosity-driven self-knowledge. We all carry around a narrative about ourselves that we have in our head. And sometimes this narrative can be quite negative. People who have negative self-beliefs, who have low self-esteem, and they actually hold those beliefs to be an accurate description of who they are. And of course, that can lead to depression. Part of a healthy mind is not so much changing the narrative, but changing our relationship to the narrative so that we can see the narrative for what it is, a constellation of thoughts. And finally, the last pillar of well-being we call purpose. And purpose is about finding one's true north and aligning more and more of our everyday behavior toward this sense of purpose. So let's take a little bit of a deeper dive into some of these pillars. With awareness, I want to just read to you a quote from William James. This is from his book, The Principles of Psychology, which appeared in 1890. And he has a whole chapter on attention. And he said the faculty of voluntarily bringing back a wandering attention over and over again is the very root of judgment, character, and will. No one is compos sui if he have it not. And education, which should improve this faculty, would be the education par excellence. But it is easier to define this ideal than to give practical directions for bringing it about. So James clearly understood the value of training attention. He didn't quite know how. Other research indicates that our minds wander so much of the time. This is from a very famous paper that was published about 10 years ago in Science that showed that the average adult spends about 47% of her or his waking life not paying attention to what they're doing. We, I believe, can do better. So we've studied the brains of expert meditators who have spent thousands in cultivating mind. One of the important of high amplitude gamma oscillations that were present during the meditation period. You can see those in the right-hand side of this figure during the time that the practitioners were meditating. And we know that gamma oscillations are very important for synaptic plasticity, also for states of insight and attention. The second pillar, connection, is about nurturing the qualities which are so important for healthy social relationships. In a randomized controlled trial that we published a number of years ago, we randomly assigned people to either a training condition where they learned to cultivate compassion in 2 weeks of training that was delivered over the internet, or they were assigned to a condition based on cognitive therapy where they learned to reappraise their thoughts in order to reappraise them in a more positive way. And what we found is that the individuals who are assigned to the compassion condition behaved in a more pro-social way on an economic decision-making task that they were given at the end of 2 weeks of training. You can see the compassion group in green here and the reappraisal group in pink. And the compassion group is exhibiting more pro-social behavior on this decision-making task. We also see that there are corresponding changes in the brain. This is illustrating the circuit that goes between the prefrontal cortex and the ventral striatum, the nucleus accumbens, an area very important in motivated behavior and positive emotion. And this connection was strengthened by just this 2 weeks of compassion training, where practitioners were training for a maximum of 30 minutes a day. So this was a total of 7 hours of training, and yet it was sufficient to see these robust changes in the brain. Insight is about self-knowledge. It is about understanding the nature of this narrative that we all carry around about ourselves. And one of the most profound consequences of developing insight and not grasping onto this concept of ourselves so strongly is that it can affect our physical experience of pain and help us to cultivate resilience. And so this is just illustrative of the kind of changes that we see, where this is depicting a person who may be subjected to a certain kind of stressor that occurs at this time point 3, and there's a natural recovery following the stressor. And a second individual is illustrated in blue here, who reaches the same amplitude of response, but recovers much more quickly. And it turns out that we can measure these changes in the brain. In a study that we did looking at pain responsivity in long-term meditators, what we see in the MRI scanner is this. When, and this is a very simple experiment where we present a tone to a practitioner, which indicates that in 10 seconds, he or she will receive a very painful heat stimulus on their wrist, which is a very sensitive area. So a non-meditator comes into the lab and hears the tone, and they immediately begin to activate what we call the pain matrix, a set of regions in the brain that is responsive to physical pain. When the actual physical pain comes on, they continue to respond, and they have a very slow recovery. In contrast, when a long-term meditator is presented with the identical conditions, they hear the tone that denotes that in 10 seconds they will receive this pain, And there's nothing in the pain matrix that activates significantly. There are no significant changes, which is quite remarkable. They don't show this anticipatory response. But then when the actual heat comes on, they show a very large response. And when it goes off, they quickly recover. This is the neural signature of resilience. Finally, purpose is so important, it turns out, for our physical health. Research indicates that people who describe themselves as having a strong sense of purpose, people who are in the 90th percentile and having a strong sense of purpose, are much more likely to live longer. This is a study done with people who are 65 years and older. And what you can see is that these people are much less likely to die over the next 5 years compared to a group of people in the 10th percentile, the lowest level of having a sense of purpose. They're much more likely to die sooner. This and other evidence like it suggests that these qualities really get under the skin and affect our well-being and physical health. So we are interested in nourishing our mind and through that changing the world. Research shows that these practices can reduce implicit bias. They can increase school achievement in students. They can even reduce healthcare costs, improve teamwork and collaboration, reduce distraction, and increase productivity, focus, creativity, and resilience. So I would encourage you to please check out our website. You can go to tryhealthyminds.org. We have developed an app to cultivate each of these 4 constituents of well-being. This app is freely available all over the world. Please join us on this journey and become a citizen scientist. This is just a few shots of what this app looks like. And let me end with a quote from the Dalai Lama from a book that was on the bestseller list for quite some time called The Art of Happiness. The Dalai Lama said, "The systematic training of the mind, the cultivation of happiness, the genuine inner transformation by deliberately selecting and focusing on positive mental states and challenging negative mental states is possible because of the very structure and function of the brain. But the wiring in our brains is not static, not irrevocably fixed. Our brains are also adaptable." Thank you so much, and I appreciate you listening.
I would like to tell you about the first results on the psychophysiological research of Buddhist meditations. For these studies, at the initiative of the Dalai Lama 14, in 2019, in the south of India, we organized 2 physiological laboratories based on 2 large Buddhist centers that unite monasteries, universities. It is extremely important that young monks trained by us in Russia carry out all the laboratory work. With the support of Dalai Lama 14th, a close working relationship was established with monasteries and monks, leading to more than 100 monks in meditation studies leading to the pandemic. We will report the first results of these studies. Here you can see the moment of inauguration of our lab, one of our lab, and here you can see that all abbots from the south of India, Tibetan monasteries, took part in this inauguration. Here you see our seminar in the conference room in the lab, and here you see real study. I would like to mention about laboratory task. First of all, we will investigate psychophysiological correlates of a certain type of Buddhist meditation. As a first attempt, we concentrated on 1-point meditation After, we will investigate different kinds of meditation, but now one-point meditation. The general aim is to investigate scientific background of presumably existed Buddhist phenomena. And in our work, we have a very strong limitation that we don't touch at all Buddhist philosophical and religious aspects of Buddhist phenomena. We will investigate exclusively scientific manifestation of this phenomena. It means that our aim is to investigate first whether this phenomena really do exist, and if yes, we intend to investigate their physiological origin and physiological features. So I would like to outline that we use only objective methods of investigation, records of our devices, but not our feeling and something like this. I would like to say that this study has a unique quantitative and qualitative sample of subjects, more than 100. And all these monks performing meditation based on one-pointed concentration. What is very important that there was opportunity to conduct this study in their usual environment, in the conditions of a monastery, in their rooms, in laboratory in the monasteries, and that young monks carried out these studies, which allow us to avoid many psychological problems. Now, I would like to give the word to my colleague, Yulia Бойцова, who directly carried out all these studies in the laboratory.
Thank you, Professor Medvedev. Dear colleagues, I will tell you in more detail about the procedure of our study and about our results. And I will ask Professor Medvedev to switch slides for me. As you can see from this slide, 94 monks from different Buddhist monasteries participated in our research. And all of those monks have had some experience of meditation. Next slide, please. Next slide. Yes, thank you. As you can see, our monks performed different meditative practices, but according to Buddhist tradition, all of those practices are based on good proficiency in the practice of one-pointed concentration. And also, all of those practices introduce experienced practitioners to the state of Dharma or post-mortem meditation. Therefore, at this stage of our study, we considered those different types of meditations as a single system of meditation. Next slide, please. According to Buddhist tradition, considered meditative practices are based upon one-pointed concentration and characterized by the gradual withdrawal of gross levels of consciousness related to the five senses. We propose that from a psychophysiological perspective, this sensory consciousness withdrawal can be considered as a decrease in sensory stimuli recognition. So here we concentrated on how the above system of meditations affects the processes of perception, recognition, and differentiation of sensory signals. And for this purpose, we used oddball paradigm and mismatch negativity analysis. Thank you. It's important to say that in some previous articles, mismatch negativity changes already were analyzed during some meditation practices. But the results and conclusions of those studies differ in many ways. This can be explained by the fact that different types of meditation have been studied there. And here in our study, we investigated meditation practices that, as we know, have never been investigated in oddball paradigm with mismatch negativity analysis. Next slide, please. In our research, we created a special structured interview. This interview allowed us to consider the level of experience of our practitioners. And here we based on the number of hours spent in meditation, regularity of practice, participation in any retreats, and minutes spent in meditation during a day. And also in this interview, we try to take into account different situational subjective factors that can create some discomfort during the EEG study, and so distract our practitioners from the meditation process during our study. Next slide, please. Yes, during the mismatch negativity study, we presented for our practitioners 3 types of sounds. There were standard stimuli, low frequency tones, deviant stimuli, rarely presented high frequency tones, and also rarely presented complex new sounds. Those stimuli were presented during meditations and in the control state of relaxed wakefulness. Next slide, please. Yes, we recorded EEG in the standard way according to 10-20 system. And mismatch negativity was defined as a negative wave of event-related potentials, reflecting the difference in brain responses to standard and deviant stimuli. Because mismatch negativity has a frontal-central localization, 2 corresponding EEG derivations were selected as a region of interest for mismatch negativity analysis. Next slide. And here you can see our first result. Our data demonstrated a reduction of mismatch negativity amplitude during meditations as compared to the control state. In this picture, you can see that red line indicates the state of meditation and green line indicates the control state. This result supports our assumption that considered Buddhist meditations accompanied by a decrease in recognition of distracting sensory stimuli, at least in comparison to the state of relaxed wakefulness. Next slide. Based on the interview, we identified two groups of practitioners with different levels of experience. Our results showed that those two groups of practitioners differ in the mismatch negativity amplitude just during meditations, but not during the control state. In the more experienced group, we can see less mismatch negativity amplitude. And in this picture, you can see that red line indicates the more experienced group, and blue line indicates less experienced group of practitioners. So we can propose that the amplitude of mismatch negativity depends on the experience of our practitioners. Next slide, please. We know that mismatch negativity usually considered as a reflection of the automatic detection of any errors in the stimuli stream. In other words, mismatch negativity can be considered as a marker for error detection in a sensory modality. This allows us to consider mismatch negativity as a special case of the general brain's mechanism and error detection mechanism. Our previous studies demonstrated that no mental effort could affect the error detection mechanism. So conscious control of the error detection is impossible. But presented here results demonstrated that considered Buddhist meditations can affect the error detection in sensory modality. So we can say that presented here data can be important not only for studying Buddhist meditations or for studying of took-down phenomenon. Also, we hope that our results can be an essential step for studying the properties of the error detector. Next slide.
So, as we expected, the considered system of Buddhist meditation is accompanied by a reduced recognition of external sensory information. Considered system Buddhist meditations affect the basic mechanisms of the brain, the error detection mechanisms. And mismatch negativity depends on experience of practitioners. More experienced practitioners have a smaller amplitude of the mismatch negativity during meditation. And I would like to say that we have developed an interview which allows us to take into account the level of experience of practitioners and take into account the influence of various factors that can cause discomfort during the study and can distract practitioners from the meditation process. So we use not only time of meditation during the day, but many more other things. And I would like to say that the opening laboratory is in line with the long-term policy of the Dalai Lama 14th on the interaction of Buddhist philosophy and Western science. Here you can see two sentences from him, which was so-called very important for us when we made the solution to organize a laboratory. And first of all, is very important for religious people. And for this, we are grateful that Dalai Lama 14th for providing the opportunity to conduct research. Thank you very much.
Greetings to everyone attending the 20th World Congress of Psychophysiology. My name is Tenzin Lodin, And under the group session titled Psychophysiology of Buddhist Meditations, my individual topic is characterizing the postmodern body to inform Buddhist death practices. So the picture that I have for you in front is the earliest, arguably the earliest depiction of meditation. So the central part is the Dhammachakra, that is the teaching of Gautama Buddha. And the one on the right and left are the two deers, male and female, in single pointed focus and attention to the teachings of Dharma. So under the domain of Buddhist meditation, in particular, when we talk about Tibetan Buddhist meditation, so we first undergo the process of hearing, that is gaining or gathering the information. And second comes the contemplation, where we analyze the information gained. And then only with the meditation, so we thorough ourselves with the wisdom that has been gained after the filtration process. So nowadays, when you talk about meditation, we have different techniques and different ways of doing the meditation. But in the traditional domain, when we talk about meditation, it is either analytical meditation or the single-pointed meditation. So many of the meditation practice nowadays, particularly like the subjects of mindfulness or the compassion and so forth, are mostly under the umbrella of single-pointed meditation. So at the bottom, I've just served two examples of the meditation practices that are famous. So first we have at the Emory University, the 8-week formal training on the topic of cognitive-based compassion training. And then also at the Stanford, we have another 8-week formal training under the umbrella or the subject called compassion cultivation training. So the basic reason why it's set for 8 weeks is because 8 weeks is the time that it takes to bring changes in our brain. So in the neuroplasticity. So when you talk about the changes in terms of the prefrontal cortex and so forth, that is being visualized under the radar of EEG of MRI, fMRI. So 8 weeks is the minimal time it takes to familiarize when we undergo these trainings. So when you talk about the meditation in particular with my subject here, so it is that meditation techniques not only helping or in the neuroplasticity of ourselves while we are alive, but also it impacting at times of death. So when you talk about death, and here in domain, when we talk about the continuing or the continuation of the meditative state, being in meditative state while in the process of dying. So in Tibetan Buddhist domain, we talk about the tukdam. So that is a process or the technique of being in the meditation while you are undergoing the process of dying. So when we try to make a connection between Tibetan Buddhist meditation or Buddhist meditation and the psychophysiology, so psychophysiology, as we know, it's about reference between mind and the body. So here in the larger context, we talk about mind, body, and the behavior. So the practices or the performances on the physical aspect, bringing changes to our mentality or the mentality or it reversing back on our physical practices. So part because of our day-to-day lifestyle and behavior being the aid or the tool to bring such changes. So in terms of meditation, when you talk about these changes not only occurring at the time of our life, but also in the times of our death and so forth. So in the topic of the Tibetan exercise, also in the Tibetan Buddhism and Tibetan medicine, we take the subject of 5 elements. So 5 elements needs to be understood more on the energy level, and the 5 elements can be understood on the grosser level, subtle level, and the more subtle level. So in terms of the 5 elements in the subparticles or the subtlest form of particles, so it aids in bringing, like when we talk about the formation of the world itself or the universe itself, we take into it in the aspect of the 5 elements. So 5 elements with the boundless space being as the basis of it. And then we talk about the air element or the wind element, and then the fire element, and then the water element, and then the earth element. So it's a process of formation, like, earth, space element being the boundless one, and then the air element with the subtlest or the smallest of the movement bringing in the air element, and then air element and the space element with its little friction part generating heat, and therein we have the fire element, and then the process of condensation where we result the water element, and then at last with the solidification we have this earth element, and so forth. So when we talk about relating it with our own body formation, so we also talk about the 5 elements, and here I have taken the a stanza from the 4th Tantra of Tibetan medicine, the principal text. So there we talk about the not having earth element is not having any matter, and whereas the presence of water element doing the cohesiveness, and fire element doing the maturation, and then wind element is the giving the room or the energy for the growth, and whereas finally the space element forming the very space where the growth occurs. To exemplify it in a more clearer picture, I have the the Indian flattened bread roti. So when we are to prepare this, we talk about the flour as the earth element, and watering it bringing a dough. And then when we put it into the fire, so we have this puffing thing where it talks about the air element giving rise or moving into spaces because of the fire element giving the maturation 8. So in terms of what I'm trying to do here is the picture of 5 elements being together, resulting into all the growth and maturation, and a dysfunction or the imbalance of 5 elements resulting into all the destruction and dissolution and so forth. So when you talk about dissolution and the later part of our life, or when you talk about the death and so forth, so one big difference is how we recognize death as a Tibetan Buddhist, and recognition of death from the clinical aspects. So when you talk about death in the terms of clinical aspect, that is the cessation of the cardiac and the respiratory functions. So therein we talk about the external breathing cessation. So when the breathing movement is ceased, so we consider from the clinical aspect that someone has passed away. Whereas in terms of the Tibetan Buddhist practice, we talk about the internal breathing. So it's something that goes after the cessation of external breathing. So that is why the subject of how we caretake the death is a little different from the other traditions. So when you talk about the process of dying as per the Tibetan Buddhism, so we talk about the dissolution. So dissolution are something general that everyone can conceptualize and visualize. So when you talk about the, as I said before, the 5 elements playing the key role here. So when you talk about the dissolution of the 5 elements, so we talk about earth dissolving into water, and that is the time when we have the weakening of our body parts and the visibility going down and so forth, and also digestion also takes a step back. And then when you talk about the water element dissolving into fire, and that's when all the liquid parts of our body, the moisture parts, ceases. And then when we talk about the fire element dissolving into wind element or the air element, it is when all the heat parts of our body is gone down and ceases, and also we fail in terms of recognizing those who are near and so forth. And finally, when wind dissolves into consciousness, or the wind dissolves into the mind element, that is when the external breathing ceases. So when in the Tibetan medicine and Buddhist practice, we talk about the 10 wind movements. So all these ceases at this time. And that is when the clinical aspect, we recognize someone as dead or someone who has passed away. And in terms of Tibetan Buddhist practice, so we say it has gone into the process of 3 visions. So we have the 33 mind of luminous appearance, and 40 mind of luminous radiance, and the 7 mind of luminous radiance, imminence, sorry. So we talk about these being the more on the subtle part. So to exemplify it for a clearer understanding, so in our day-to-day life, from the morning till we go to bed, it's more like on the grosser level, because our sensorial receptors or sensorial organs are at play. So we see and we touch and we smell and so forth. And then the dream level or the dream time is more like the subtle, where these sensorial parts are addressed, but our mental activity still continues, that we experience things, but on a more subtle level. And when you talk about the extreme subtleness, it's more on the deep sleep level, where you don't visualize or see or experience anything. So to put in the context of the Buddhist meditation, we say the experience that we gain on the coarse level or the grosser level, and also on the subtle level, so much so that we impact the extreme subtle when in the stage of deep sleep, as I've exemplified before. So it's not something that is easy or something that can be performed in few days part, but it's the continuous stages of practice that finally, at the time of death, as I've said before, in terms of tuktam, so you see that there is the delayed, in our death process. So someone is more in a meditative state that continues, like we have this last year where we have, or this year, sorry, we have someone in this stage for 30 plus days. So this is when this meditation process that they have, accumulated or gained the wisdom during their life, that is reflected in the times of clear light of death or clear light of meditation aspect. So it's something about when we are at the time of death, so all the external subjects ceases, and then then the effort is made that it brings the changes or the effects on the internal aspect. So in terms of channels, so though it's little sort of like Greeky thing here, but when you talk about the channels, so we have, as you can see in the picture, 3 channels. So right channel and left channel and the central channel. So when we are alive, the right and left channel takes the play. And when we are at the time of death, when the external breathing ceases, so it all affects the central channel. And that's when these are subtle and extreme subtle are experiences. So that is why in the Tibetan Buddhist practices, especially at the time of death, or when we talk about caretaking the death, we say that the 3 days, at least 3 days, the deceased one has to be left before the cremation or the burial process is performed. So generally 3 days is being left while we do the spiritual practices and so forth. So also in terms of, when you look into the scriptures of Gautama Buddha, and also practice said by, there's a Sangye Jasu Rinpoche, a learned master in the 17th century. It was said that for a spiritual master, for that he has, accumulated and gained practices and so forth. So a week period has to be left before we carry forward the burial or the cremation process. And in terms of tuktam, as I've said before, for the master who has continued to be in the meditative state, even after all the cessation has occurred, so it has to be left till we see signs that the tuktam has been ceased or released. So caretaking the body, so we say that, as I've said before, the implementation or the importance of the 5 elements. Here also, at the time of ceases, we also discuss in an aspect of 5 elements. So we have earth element where we have the process of burial, and then we have water element where we have, disposing the body into the water, and then we have fire elements. So we have this cremation that is the most common practice in the Buddhist practice nowadays, especially in exile here. And then we have the sky burial. So that is, in sync with the Buddhist practice, where we say not just while we are alive, we generate for the benefit of others. So even at the time of death, so our bodies are cut in pieces and offered to the vultures and eagles and so forth. And then finally is the rain body, that is, owing to your Buddhist practice. So your body is shrinked, and so much so that in the seasoned practitioners, so the body is shrinked itself, that only the nail and the hair is left. So this is the my presentation. And finally, I'd like to end with the quotation that is, everyone you meet is fighting a battle you know nothing about. Be kind always. Thank you so much.
So first, I'd like to thank the organizers for bringing us all together for the 20th World Congress of Psychophysiology and providing our symposia with the opportunity to share on this novel topic. So I'm going to be speaking on integrating Tibetan and Western psychophysiological approaches to meditation. This takes off where Dr. Davidson and Dr. Medvedev left off, Dr. Davidson presenting on the achievements of contemplative research over the last several decades, and Dr. Medvedev presenting on their specific meditation study in South India that also relates to our team's collaborative work. I will also touch on several takeaways from our Tibetan colleagues' presentations as we highlight the value of doing community-based participatory research, the importance of cultural paradigms in nuancing and generating hypotheses in our psychophysiological examinations of cultural phenomena, their contributions to co-developing the constructs that we're analyzing, and helping implement the specific ways in which we are measuring those constructs. So I'll be giving a little bit of a background on the approach and motivation shaping our methodology, framing a way in which psychophysiological approaches to a cultural phenomenon have engaged by our team. And I'm going to go over a specific cultural phenomena in this context that you've heard about from our other speakers, the case of tukdam, a post-death meditative state from the Tibetan cultural perspective that has drawn attention for its unique psychophysiological features. We're going to look at the importance of establishing a common ground between the ways these two different intellectual traditions investigate phenomena. This is through the lens of biomarkers. We'll be looking at how our methods are shaped then by these approaches and the cultural insights of our collaborators, guiding our hypotheses and the way in which we then scientifically test them by co-developing constructs and applied measures. Finally, I'll be briefly touching on some of our preliminary results thus far, and then focus more on what we see as our future directions in this collaborative study. So first of all, some background motivation as to why integrate cultural approaches in psychophysiological study. So we've seen burgeoning research on contemplative practice over the last several decades, which Dr. Davidson has covered beautifully in his presentation, and I'll just highlight a few relevant details here. And this is across many disciplines, showing beneficial outcomes to well-being across numerous psychophysiological measures. We see the reduction of distractibility, and through also self-reports of greater happiness and greater well-being, and reducing that distraction through cultivated focused attention and present-centered awareness. Reductions in depression and anxiety have been shown by various researchers indicated here through enhancing specific cognitive capacities, such as self and other perception, ameliorating the physiological and inflammatory markers of stress, such as cortisol, blood pressure, heart rate, and triglycerides, as well as other lipids, C-reactive protein, and numerous dimensions of peripheral cytokine expressions. We also see the slowed progression of chronic inflammatory disease, particularly those with mental health comorbidities, and strengthening of the immune response, increasing vagal tone, slowing cellular aging, and telomere shortening, and modulating the inflammatory-aging pathways. Maria Kozhevnikov's work has also shown several practices specific to Vajrayana Buddhism, those cultivated in Tibetan Buddhism, which create heightened arousal, heightened sympathetic activation, and phasic alertness, while others can intentionally elicit heightened parasympathetic activity and tonic alertness, such as a calm and alert state of mind. So this perspective then begs the question, how do individuals vary across these different outcomes and these different protocols? Well, today we actually have very little work that is focused on analyzing these outcomes, and it's something that we're focused on here at the Center for Healthy Minds. What we do know is that expert meditators compared to age-matched novice meditators demonstrate significantly different both structural and functional activity in the brain. We know that there's a wide degree of individual variation across these outcomes, even among age-matched novices and meditation naive. We also know that there's a lot of individual difference in response to different types of practice, whether it's mindfulness, focused attention, loving kindness, compassion, open monitoring, de-reification, and so forth, which you heard about just a bit ago from our speakers previously. So we also know that expert level meditators, those who we might call Olympic level practitioners, have achieved more than 60,000 hours of meditation over the course of their life, and they show distinct physiologies compared to the meditation naive, such as sustained, distinct brainwaves. We also know that a select few of the expert meditators seem to present a quite different physiology in the dying process and an attenuated decomposition thereafter. And we'll get into that in just a minute. So, why integrate these cultural approaches in psychophysiological studies? And what can the dying state tell us about the psychophysiology of that living individual during their life course? Well, here also we can see that most of the protocols used in meditation research today with meditation naive participants come from Buddhist traditions. And these protocols and practices were largely informed by or directly derived from the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, including various techniques developed from its schools. So we see the cognitively based compassion training, CBCT, developed at Emory University, compassion and cultivation training, CCT, developed at Stanford University. Also our very own Dr. Richie Davidson and his colleague Dr. Cortland Dahl here at UW-Madison with the Healthy Minds program. All of these guided under the Dalai Lama's guidance, as well as other masters of practice. And then we also see the indirect influences on mindfulness-based stress reduction developed by John Kabat-Zinn at University of Massachusetts Medical Center, where he also brought in Zen Buddhist approaches into the protocol. And this has become one of the most prevalent protocols today. So this said, we know that the outcomes expected from the tradition have been tested empirically over many generations. And the reason why these methods work for certain individuals is also explicitly described and rigorously explicated. The dangers also to specific individuals that show, say, a predisposition for certain cognitive affective patterns or have certain physiological conditions is also indicated. So this provides an important motivation for then integrating cultural approaches and insights from our cultural experts in our psychophysiological study of meditation. The Tibetan medical tradition has also co-developed with Tibetan Buddhism for over 1,000 years. It's a theory-praxis tradition of health and well-being that has cultivated extensive knowledge around tracking individual differences related to these cognitive affective patterns that impact both health and illness in the body and mind across the life course. And it specifically emphasizes the role of meditation as a behavioral therapeutic that can ameliorate different afflictive conditions, persistent deleterious behaviors, and their consequent health outcomes. So integrating both the Buddhist and the Tibetan medical perspective as these cultural paradigms allows us to then generate hypotheses within these construct frameworks for more nuanced measure development. So how do we start? A common ground that we have developed in this collaboration is looking at biomarkers as the psychophysiological intersections of both intellectual traditions and how they investigate phenomena, both physiological and cognitive, in their respective paradigms. So Western biomedical research communities have relied on biomarkers to index function and dysfunction using measurable features known to represent either directly or indirectly pathways that link intervention to their influential upstream factors and their consequent outcomes. So you think about HbA1c as a biomarker looking at the context of, say, diet or medication or stress, and how that's modulated then over time to look at 3-month averages of glycemic control and the disease course of diabetes over time. We also see that biomarkers delineate these pathways as they run from exposures in a given context, or say in our case, a meditation intervention or lifetime practice, as it relates to various outcomes in health and well-being, or the various constructs that we're looking at. Tibetan medical communities similarly rely on biomarkers to track function and dysfunction on the various attendant pathways that they recognize, and their conditional factors demonstrate influences from exposures to their resulting effects. They also integrate perceptual cues, so this is observation, and their inferential interpretations. And this is derived from the Buddhist epistemological tradition, a discourse of intellectual scholasticism that assesses the validity of evidence gained through perceptual means, instrumentation, or otherwise. So this has also been used in the Western context throughout history as well. You think about a physician's use of a stethoscope to perceive or auscultate the different kinds of sounds arising in lungs for differential diagnostic relevance. It is through the doctor's perceptual capacity in hearing and skilled training to distinguish these sounds for expert interpretation. So this is still part of our Western medical tradition, but it has become less so over time. In the Tibetan medical tradition, this is still a very important means of identifying trajectories in the body and mind and predicting specific outcomes. So what have we learned so far in using these different paradigms to also understand the research outcomes with expert meditators? Well, one thing that we've learned is that expert meditators have altered structure and function in the brain sustained gamma waves, irrespective of state or activity, heightened emotional regulation. They show differentiated immune response and inflammatory reactivity ameliorated to a given stimulus, among these numerous other outcomes listed here. We also then hypothesize with our cultural collaborators that these effects influence the dying process and perhaps also significantly the body's decompositional rate and quality. So these culturally informed, scientifically testable hypotheses have guided then our current study collaboration. So the critical contributions from our cultural expert collaborators have included the identification of what is considered an expert meditator. So this is a level of practice hours that provides a degree of achievement that is considered beyond what a normal practitioner might gain in their lifetime from this cultural perspective. This is over 60,000 hours of practice, which is clearly beyond the 10,000 hour mark rule of thumb for field-specific expertise developed by psychologist Anders Ericsson. Also, that the dying process itself is seen as an important moment and context of spiritual achievement. It's not presented with fear or loathing. It's actually a welcome opportunity because it allows for the practitioner to gain insight into the moments of mind and quality of mind that might not be accessible in other experiences throughout the lifetime or might require a lifetime of practice for which to prepare. So this, we would predict, then has a significant influence on the stress neurobiology during the dying process and the effects that we see in the decomposition and deterioration. We also would predict potentially reduced inflammation systemically and its effect on aging. This is the inflamma-aging pathway signals as well. Our cultural experts also describe the importance of evoking loving kindness and compassion in the contemplative practices that are used at this point and throughout the life course. The realization of interdependence of all beings, a reduced clinging to the self, the body, one's loved ones, and the current life, with a view of reincarnation that affects this perspective on death, and quite different from many Euro-American cultural contexts. So again, reducing the stress reactivity in the body provides an opening for the parasympathetic nervous system to be primarily engaged through the meditative state. Through our cultural expert collaborators, the importance of a tradition's highly detailed account textually, as well as in practice, of these various stages of death has provided important framing for the project, because the dying process and the related experiences are seen as a highly valued context. So the tradition itself has tracked the physiological and cognitive nuances that an individual, quote, presents with through the dying process. These are both phenomenological in the individual's experience, as well as third-person observational for those who are tracking the process of the person dying. In terms of the integration then of our Tibetan and Western psychophysiological insights, it's allowed us to think through the specific measures that we're using in this project. So our study explores both Tibetan and Western body assessments of psychophysiological changes for the cultural case of Tukdam. Tukdam, as you see depicted here, is a meditative state achieved at death in which practitioners exhibit this suspension of normal decomposition chronology. Many remain upright, and you'll see a maintained skin tone and quality. No emitted putrid odors, often it's described a fragrant odor, and this can persist for sometimes 3 weeks or more. So schematically, the process looks like a marked divergence in the normal chronology of physiological events in the peri- and post-mortem process, here detailed with Tukdam at the top and the classic Western forensic perspective below on the time course of physiological changes in the body. So we're looking at how this work can frame psychophysiological measures in general and in meditation research more broadly through these methods. In the case of Tukdam, this has facilitated investigation of the markers of skin discoloration and elasticity, regions of body temperature, decomposition, also showing a novel attenuated process compared to published standards, as well as the particular markers ascertained, such as the rate of attenuated decomposition, the potential classes of ambient odorant molecules, and the temporal window of persistent neural activity could be distinct. So though we have not been able to measure an individual in the dying process yet, what we have been able to get is as early as 22 hours post-mortem. And so we predict that, similar to what we see in the animal literature when animals are sacrificed, as well as in the human literature when humans are taken off life support, a residual EEG signal persists that would inform and provide a baseline for us to test whether these individuals who have achieved a greater number of lifetime hours of meditation and enter the dying process in a unique way do exhibit a different response in the brain at the time of dying. So Tibet medical theory also predicts some residual brain activity persistent, particularly in Tukdam practitioners, for an abbreviated period following clinical death, and yet hypothesizes the source of attenuated decomposition as the subtle still activity remaining centered at the vagal innervation to the heart. So this is something that has also allowed us to consider what kind of measures we can look at in terms of peripheral nervous system activity, peripheral biology, glycogen cycling, and so forth. And since the marked attenuated decomposition has been observed culturally in the thoracic chest region, this has also guided the next line of forensic assessments and measure predictions in our Tuktum cases, which you see also outlined here in the gray boxes. So in closing, in our future directions, we are including several new forensic measures in which we are calibrating skin color and discoloration across different cameras, lighting situations, and contexts so that they can all be standardized. We are also interested in the possibility of bringing on a measure of the buccal mucosa to look at telomere signaling, microbiome community transitions, and also keeping in the back of our minds peripheral glycogen cycling, as well as attenuated immune senescence as two areas that would allow for particularly engaging future investigation if a unique opportunity arose given the cultural sensitivity of the phenomena and also the precautions taken by our team when we observe one. So without our cultural collaborators to investigate a phenomena that is relatively rare in the population, what might look like an outlier in terms of the dying process psychophysiologically, we have the opportunity to investigate a very unique process in a unique setting and circumstances. So thank you for your attention. I look forward to any questions or comments you might have.